so far this semester is in the Omnivore's Dilemma. This first section of the book has a lot to do with corn. And corn is important because corn is grown in great abundance because it's cheap and relatively easy to grow it. One of the reasons that it's cheap is that it's heavily subsidized by the government. And when we start talking about economics, we'll talk about what the subsidy structure is of the U.S. Department of Agriculture and how that drives down the price of things like corn. Because it's cheap, it means that it is abundant. And those two things go hand in hand. Once again, when we talk about economics, we'll discover why cheap and abundant go hand in hand. But as a result, it gets repurposed for all sorts of uses. So we have corn in cornflakes, and we have corn and corn on the cob, and we have all of these ways in which corn kind of resembles corn. But then we have all these other ways in which corn doesn't resemble corn. Corn has been transformed into adhesives. Corn has been transformed into ceramics. Corn has been transformed into plastics. And all those things, you wouldn't know that those things were corn-based unless a material scientist actually told you that that was the case. But not only has corn been repurposed into all these other kinds of industrial uses, corn has been repurposed as a food. So corn is abundant, and so it gets used to feed people. But it also gets repurposed to feed animals. And in the case of feeding people, corn is complicated because we eat corn in the form of corn, but then we also eat corn in the form of things like high fructose corn syrup, which used to not even be a thing until the 1970s. So when you drink a soft drink or an energy drink or something like that, you look at the label, and oftentimes the next most common ingredient after water is high fructose corn syrup. Once again, a form of corn that you wouldn't recognize as corn. And the issue with corn in animals, in animal production, is that it has a lot of calories. And so if you want your cattle to gain weight quickly, your pigs or your cows or whatever it is, it's easier to feed them corn, even in animals that are not accustomed or evolved to eating grain crops and are more evolved to eat pasture. So we use corn to feed animals, even animals that evolutionarily are grazers. And when I talk about grazers, these are animals that forage on grass, and not the seed heads of grass, but actually the bodies of grasses, as opposed to corn, which is actually the seed of the grasses. So that's kind of where we're headed. In the process of going there, we've had to talk about the basic biology of plants. We have had to talk about the genetics of plants and animals. And the reason that we're talking about the genetics of plants and animals is for two reasons. All of our domesticated vegetable crops, seed crops, and our animal crops have come from what we refer to as natural progenitors. Natural progenitors are the native animals and plants that occurred in a particular region that people found agricultural uses for, and then over time, we altered those organisms. So, for example, in the case of teosinte, we took this small plant, multi-stalked plant, with a few number of seeds that it produces on the plant, and we transformed it over time into this single-stalked plant that produces one ear of corn. That one ear of corn has a lot of kernels on it. And that transformation is a genetic transformation that occurred primarily by artificial selection being exerted by the early people in Mesoamerica who found teosinte to be of use to them. And so it is useful as we think about agriculture to think about where these organisms that we use in agriculture came from, because it also helps us understand kind of why human culture became what it is. So there's this idea that you can't separate culture from the agricultural basis that is the basis of culture. And this is an idea that's not new to him, but there is, on the Moodle site, there is a chapter by a guy named Jared Diamond about the origins of agriculture and how agriculture shaped human culture. And so it's in the readings for Wednesday. So there's a October 6th thing there. Yeah.
Was it from Guns, Germs, and Steel?
It is from Guns, Germs, and Steel. Yep. Yeah. Well, the chapter is on Moodle as well. It's called History's Haves and Have-Nots. And it basically talks about how having a diverse community of potential food sources was crucial in establishing the earliest civilizations. And then it also explores why some civilizations thrived and survived for really long periods of time, and other civilizations eventually fell apart. And so it's a way of thinking about human history, but thinking about it through the lens of ecology, and thinking about it through the lens of evolutionary biology. So oftentimes when we think about history, we think about human history as something that is driven by the people who are involved in the history, forces of personality, leadership skills, decisions that are made, et cetera, et cetera. Another way of looking at history is just as something that happens through a series of fortuitous occurrences. And Jared Diamond in this book puts forth an evolutionarily and ecologically based history of human civilization, which is different from what you probably got in a history class at some time in the past. So, in order to understand modern agriculture, you have to understand not only the basic biology of the organisms that are used in agriculture, plants and animals, but it's also useful to understand where these plants and animals came from. And so for the next couple of days, what we're going to do is we're going to explore this. If you look on the schedule, we're 3 or 4 days behind schedule. That's fine, but just follow along with where we're at. I'll work on getting an updated schedule posted here in the next day or two. So today what we're going to do is I'm going to teach you how biologists recreate the evolutionary history of a group of organisms. And then with that knowledge, we can look at the evolutionary histories of things like cows and pigs and chickens and things like that to kind of understand how these things came into being as our modern agricultural crops. And then on Wednesday, we will do a similar thing, although not as drawn out, with plants. And then we'll start talking about kind of this agricultural basis of civilization. Questions about where we've been or where we're going? Okay, then let's get started. So this first part is the origin of domesticated crops, but this first part deals with animals. So essentially, I want you to be able to understand two things. The first thing I want you to understand is how biologists can go about figuring out what the evolutionary history of a group of organisms is without the use of a time machine, because while a time machine would be cool, we don't have a time machine. And then I want you to understand the origins of our major food groups, both plant and animal. So I want you to understand that the food that we eat is the result of an evolutionary history of our relationship with plants and animals, and it's in part due to this biogeographic happenstance. Certain animals happen to have already been on a landscape at a time when humans came along. Those humans came along, found those animals and plants useful, and turned those animals and plants to their own uses, and that's where agriculture came from. And then Jared Diamond explores this thing. And that's what we'll be doing at the end of class on Wednesday and into Friday. So, have you guys ever seen an evolutionary tree like this? A branching diagram that purports to show you the evolutionary relationships among a group of organisms? How many of you have seen this in a textbook or somewhere before in the past? Okay, probably back in high school. What it basically says is that these taxa here are organisms that we can see on the landscape today. So we have, a pigeon and a turtle and a lion and a cat. And the cat and the lion are most closely related to one another because they share a common ancestor more recently than they share a common ancestor with turtles or birds. Turtles and birds share a common ancestor more recently with one another than they share a common ancestor with domestic cats and lions. But all of these things have a common ancestor if you go back far enough in evolutionary time. And so in this case, time is moving from the bottom of the diagram to the top of the diagram. This is the past, this is the present. And morphological variation is on the x-axis. You could just as easily turn this on its side, and time would move from left to right, and morphological variation would be on the y-axis. It doesn't really matter at all. The reason that biologists do these things is because it's important for us as we think about organisms to think about relatedness among organisms. So for example, grasses all have a particular growth form. They have fibrous roots, they have tall stalks, they have a particular type of flower that we've talked about. And all grasses share those things in common. And the reason that grasses share those things in common is because they all evolved from a common ancestor way back in evolutionary history. C4 photosynthesis, though, is interesting. A lot of grasses do C4 photosynthesis, but not all grasses do C4 photosynthesis. C4 photosynthesis is also not only found in just grasses. Grasses is where we'll talk about them because grasses are an important food source. But C4 photosynthesis evidently has evolved multiple times within plant evolution. And the reason that we know this is because when we look at the evolutionary relationships among plants, we see some lineages of plants evolved C4 photosynthesis, and other lineages of plants also evolved C4 photosynthesis, but those two lineages aren't closely related to one another at all. They don't share a common ancestor very recently in evolutionary history. And so then it becomes interesting to biologists, well, why did multiple lineages of plants stumble upon this solution to losing too much water while doing photosynthesis? Why did they all stumble upon the C4 pathway of photosynthesis? Because the interesting thing about the C4 pathway of photosynthesis in all these distinct lineages is it looks exactly the same. Same structure of the enzymes, same localization of the processes within the leaves of the plant. It's all the same. So it's this example of what we call convergent evolution, where multiple different independent lineages have figured out the same solution to an environmental problem. And the only way that we can figure out that that's happening is if we have an idea of what the evolutionary history of a group of organisms is. So while you've probably seen these figures before, you probably have no idea how scientists generate them. So I'm going to demystify that for you. So what I want us to do is start off with a group of organisms that we are pretty familiar with. Do you guys know what a lamprey is? Anybody? No? It's a jawless fish. It looks like a worm, but it's actually a protovertebrate. It's a early organism that is related to vertebrates but isn't a vertebrate itself. It doesn't have a backbone, but it has a notochord that goes down its back. You also had a notochord when you were an embryo. Your notochord disappeared during development. But these things, they have sucker mouths and they suck onto the sides of fishes. They have these rasping teeth and they burrow into the side of fishes and basically suck the blood out of the fish and then discard the fish. So this is what we refer to as a jawless fish. You guys know what a perch is? Perch or bluegill, bass. This is one of the bony fishes. You guys know what salamanders are? Anybody ever seen a salamander out in the wild? No, but you've seen them other places? Okay. Salamander is a type of amphibian. Lizards are a type of reptile. They're closely related to snakes. Crocodiles, obviously, are crocodiles, alligators, those organisms. Another group of reptiles. Pigeons are a type of bird. We see them flying around our cities all the time. And then a mouse is an example of a mammal. So if you want to know how these organisms are evolutionarily related to one another, you have to first know what you want to know is related to what, but then you need to build what we call a character matrix. We have to know what characteristics each of these organisms possess. And presumably, the characters that we choose are going to be characters that have useful information in them. So for example, salamanders, lizards, crocodiles, pigeons, and mice all have four limbs. We have two forelimbs and we have two hind limbs. So having four limbs isn't useful in telling us how pigeons might be related to crocodiles or how pigeons might be related to salamanders because they all have four limbs. So that doesn't carry any information. But the fact that all of these groups have four limbs and these groups don't, that then carries some information because we can say, oh, well, chances are all these organisms that have four limbs are more closely related to one another than they are to these two groups of organisms that don't have limbs. So we're always using characters to group taxa together. So what we want to do is we want to have two things. We want an outgroup. We want a group of organisms that we know is ancient and old. And in this case, our outgroup is the lamprey. Lampreys don't have bony skeletons. They don't have vertebral columns. They don't have many of the characters that we think of as belonging to the vertebrates, organisms that do have internal skeletons and do have a vertebral column. And so we use the lamprey as an outgroup because it doesn't have any of the characteristics that some of these other organisms have. And we use that outgroup to say what the direction of evolutionary change is. So if you have an outgroup organism that doesn't have four limbs, and all of the groups that you're interested in do have four limbs, presumably four limbs evolved at some time between that outgroup and the in-group taxa. So this allows us to what biologists refer to as polarizing our characters. This polarizing of characters allows us to know the direction evolution is moving. So in this case, the lamprey is our outgroup. So what this brand of biology does is it seeks to group taxa on the basis of shared characteristics but not ancestral characteristics. So, but what we call derived characteristics. And this is why we have an outgroup. The lamprey doesn't have jaws. So lacking jaws is an ancestral characteristic. They don't have lungs. So lacking lungs is an ancestral characteristic. They don't have claws or nails. So lacking claws and nails is an ancestral characteristic. They don't have a gizzard. That lack of a gizzard is an ancestral characteristic. They don't have feathers. They don't have hair. They don't have mammary glands. They don't have scales. They don't have all of these things because those lackings are all ancestral characters. Having a gizzard, having claws, having lungs, having four limbs, etc., those are all things that evolved over time. If you look back in the fossil record, there comes a point when none of the fishes had limbs. There are some fishes that have little primitive limbs, but if you go back far enough, there aren't any organisms on the face of the earth that have four limbs. So we know from the fossil record that there was a time when nobody had limbs, and then there came a time when organisms had limbs. And so we know that limbedness is an evolved characteristic, not an ancestral characteristic. So what we try to do is we try to look at our character matrix and say, what's the biggest group that we can group together on the basis of one of these shared evolutionarily derived characters? So when you look at this matrix, what would you see is your best bet for doing that? Yeah, the presence of jaws, because everybody has jaws except the lamprey. So that means that we can separate the lamprey out by itself, and then everybody else forms this new group that lacks lampreys, and one of the things that holds that group together is the presence of jaws. And so we can start building our diagram where we separate the lamprey out. Jaws evolved somewhere in evolutionary time between when the lamprey broke off and when all of these other groups formed. So in this case, time is going from left to right. Morphological differentiation is in the y-axis. So we've now taken care of jaws. What's the next most useful characteristic for now dividing up the groups that remain? The presence of lungs. So most fish do not have lungs, and all these other groups do have lungs, with a couple of exceptions. There's some salamander species that don't have lungs, but the vast majority of them do have lungs. Those are details that we don't really need to get into, but the presence of lungs helps us separate the perch from all the rest of these guys. And so once again, we can go back to our diagram. Perch come off by themselves. Lungs then group this entire group here because all of those taxa have lungs. So the lamprey branched off evolutionarily most distantly in the past. Then the bony fishes branched off, and then all these other groups are found here. So we've now taken care of two of these characters. What's the next most useful character? Okay, claws or nails. Because you have four groups here that have claws or nails, you only have three groups here that have keratinous scales, kinds of scales that you see on snakes and lizards and things like this. So we have four groups that have claws. That then excludes salamanders and all the other amphibians. So once again, we would have the salamanders being separated from everybody else on the basis of the fact that they lack claws and nails. They have lungs, they have jaws, but they lack nails and claws. So now the easy part is over. What would be the next most informative characteristic to think about? The scales. Lizards, crocodiles, and pigeons have scales. Mice and other mammals do not. Thank God we don't have scales. That would be gross. We have hair instead. So we can now separate the mammals out, which then leaves us this grouping of all the other groups. The mouse has nails and claws, has lungs, has jaws, but doesn't have these scales like reptiles have. We can go back to our character matrix. What is the next most useful character in grouping things together? The presence of a gizzard. The presence of a gizzard groups crocodiles and pigeons together, and so we end up with lizards that don't have a gizzard, but they have keratinous scales, claws and nails, lungs and jaws, which then separates lizards from the pigeon and the crocodile, and so we get this evolutionary tree out of this analysis. Now, did we take care of all of the characteristics that were in the character matrix? We didn't, did we? What's left over? We took care of jaws, lungs, claws and nails, gizzards, and keratinous scales, but now we have a couple of things that only occur in one particular taxon. What we do with these is we just attach them to those branches where those characters occur. So in the case of feathers, that would go on the pigeon branch. Hair and mammary glands would go on the mammal branch or the mouse branch. And so we would have something that looked like this, where feathers only applied to pigeons and hair and mammary glands only apply to the mice. So this is basically what evolutionary biologists do when they want to know how a group of organisms is related to one another. They build a big character matrix for all of the taxa that they want to know about the relationships, and then they go through this process of grouping smaller and smaller groups of organisms together on the basis of these shared evolutionarily derived characteristics. Did you guys know that crocodiles and alligators are more closely related to birds than they are to all of the other reptiles? Did you guys watch Jurassic Park? The first Jurassic Park? There's actually some decent biology in that movie. At the very beginning, when Dr. Grant is in the desert out in Montana, in the Badlands in Montana, digging up velociraptors, he makes this little soliloquy about the relationship between birds and dinosaurs. And essentially, the dinosaurs didn't go extinct as much as they evolved into birds. And that actually is borne out by phylogenetic analyses, these types of evolutionary recreations. And so birds are more closely related to reptiles than they are, for example, to mammals. We a lot of times think about birds and mammals being together because they're both warm-blooded, but that actually happens to be one of these convergent characteristics that evolved at different points on different independent lineages within the vertebrate evolutionary tree. So it isn't hard to do this thing once you know how it's done. It just looks mysterious because nobody ever explains the method to you. Do you have any questions about this? Which direction is time moving in this figure? It's moving from the left to the right, from the past to the present. Each of these nodes is a common ancestor, the common ancestor of all the crocodiles and the common ancestor of all the birds. There's a common ancestor here that is the common ancestor of lizards, crocodiles, and pigeons. So is a lizard more closely related to a pigeon, or is it more closely related to a mouse? Is the lizard more closely related to the pigeon, or is the lizard more closely related to the mouse? Mouse. Why did you say mouse? Repeat. Okay, so the node for the common ancestor is right next to it. Is that the criterion that we should be using? How do we determine relatedness? So if I was to make my family tree, I am more closely related to my sister than I am to anybody else. We are the most evolutionarily derived of the people in our family. Our ancestor is my dad. My dad's ancestor is my granddad. Is my dad more closely related to me and my sister, or is he more closely related to his grandfather? Okay, so you're using these two nodes are together with one another. Because of meiosis, half of my genes came from my dad, and my sister, half of her genes came from my dad. My father has half of his genes coming from his dad. But that's all he has from his dad. The other half of his genes are from his grandmother. My dad shares a lot more genes with me and my sister because each of us got a half dose of his genes. And chances are that half dose is different between me and my sister because me and my sister look different for all those reasons when we talked about meiosis. So we actually have way more of my father's genetic varieties, genetic alleles, that different alleles that he has, are found in me and my sister than my granddad's genes are found in my father. So because we all share a common ancestor more recently among us three than we do with any of us do with my grandfather, we would be more related. So it isn't about whether the nodes are close to one another. It's about who do you share a common ancestor with. Lizards, crocodiles, and pigeons share a common ancestor more recently in evolutionary time than they share with a mouse. This common ancestor that is shared by mice, lizards, crocodiles, and pigeons is further back in evolutionary time than the common ancestor grouping these. So lizards are actually more closely related in an evolutionary sense to crocodiles and birds than they are to mammals because they share a common ancestor more recently than they do with mice. In the same way, a mouse is more related evolutionarily to these groups than it is to a lamprey because it shares a common ancestor here with these groups. It doesn't share a common ancestor until way back here in the past with the lamprey. So that's how you determine who's most closely related. The question is not how close are your nodes together. The question is what's the most recent common ancestor that you share with a group. And so that's an important distinction to make. Questions about how to think about these evolutionary trees. one of the things you're going to be asked to do on an exam is to take a tree and interpret it, answering the kinds of questions that I was just asking you. What's the direction of time? What is morphological difference depicted as? Who's most closely related to whom based on a particular tree topology? The reason that I'm sending you through this is that when we think about cattle, for example, when we think about cows, there are a great many different kinds of cows. There's actually a great many different kinds of bovine stock. We are familiar with cows in America, but there are other bovine species that are found around the world that people also use for beef and milk and things like this. And those all have evolutionary relationships to one another. Those evolutionary relationships are tied to their geography. And because these animals are of interest to humans because they all serve as food sources, we know what their evolutionary biology is because people have studied it and recreated the evolutionary history of these things. And when you look at the evolutionary history of the organisms, it won't surprise you at all that that evolutionary history is closely tied to their geographic distribution on the face of the earth. So in order to understand the trees that I'm going to give you next, having some understanding of them is important. So when you think about a tree, think about time passing. And in the past, there is a common ancestor. We'll just call this common ancestor A. Something happens that causes that population of that common ancestor to divide into two, and those two groups start evolving independently of one another. As one branch evolves, it's moving morphologically away from species A. This other branch is evolving, moving away from species A morphologically and genetically. But this branch doesn't split, and this branch does, giving you a common ancestor B. As time continues to progress, one branch of B may branch into two new populations, giving them a common ancestor C, but the other branch coming from common ancestor B doesn't branch. Time continues to pass, and we see now that the descendant species from C, both this branch and this branch are going to divide, so that you have a common ancestor D and a common ancestor E. Time continues to pass, more splitting occurs until you finally get to the present day where these are the species that you see running around the landscape, but these are the common ancestors and the branching pattern that led to these species being present. So time is moving from left to right. Morphological divergence and genetic divergence is in the y-axis. So quiz time. They should make a Saturday Night Live sketch out of this. Who's more closely related to whom? It would be the worst Saturday Night Live sketch ever. Which of these pairs is most closely related to one another? I'll start you off with a hard one. Hmm? So we have one vote for O. Okay, one vote for O and Q. How many people say L and N? Raise your hand. You have to commit. Two people for O, L and N. How many for O and Q? I mean, it has to be the rest of you because only two people went for L and N. Why? Those of you in favor of L and N, what's your rationale? So they're all in this lineage, but who is the common ancestor of taxon L and taxon N? D, right? Who is the common ancestor of O and Q? In time, when did D and E occur? At the same time in the past or at different times in the past? Remember, time is moving in this dimension. So what's the distance in terms of time from here to here versus what is the distance in time from here to here? It's the same, isn't it? L and N are just as related to one another as O is related to Q because they share common ancestors with one another an equal amount of distance back in the past. Trick question. When did you share a common ancestor? Did you share a common ancestor? And if you did, when does that common ancestor occur in time? And in this case, both D and E were common ancestors that diverged into L and N eventually, or O and Q, at essentially the same time. Next question. Who is more closely related to one another, L and N, or L and M? All in favor of L and N? All in favor of L and M? Okay, good. Why? Yeah. L and M share a common ancestor, G, more recently than L and N share a common ancestor, which is D. That's further back in time. Which of these are most closely related? J and L or J and Q? Think about it for a minute. All in favor of J and L, raise your hands. All in favor of J and Q, raise your hands. 3 tentatives. What's the problem with this question? It's another trick question, isn't it? Why? J and L share a common ancestor. What is that common ancestor? B, isn't it? Who said B? Yeah, good. J and Q share a common ancestor. Who is that common ancestor? B. They share the same common ancestor. Therefore, they are same. They're equally distantly related. Just because J and L appear close to one another in this figure, the way it's drawn, doesn't matter. What matters is, what do J and L share in terms of common ancestor? What do J and Q share in terms of common ancestor? Because one of the things that you can do with any of these bifurcations, you can take this bifurcation and flip it, turn it on its axis at this, and if you did that, L would be down here and Q would be up here. And it doesn't change the meaning of the graph at all because you can freely rotate these taxa around the common ancestor. Just flip it. Doesn't change the evolutionary distance. Think about it this way. There's a certain amount of time from J to F. There's a certain amount of time from F to B. There's a certain amount of time from B to C. There's a certain amount of time from C to D, D to G, and G to L. We can add up all those time segments. Those time segments will be the same as going from J to F, F to B, B to C, C to E, which is the same distance as C to D, E to H, which is the same distance as D to G, and h to q, which is the same distance as g to l. They're both equally closely related to L. J, L and Q are both equally closely related to J because the time of divergence between those groups is exactly the same. So don't get suckered into thinking, oh, well, they're closer to one another here, therefore they must be most closely related. They are linked to one another through common ancestry. Okay? All right. Are you more clear or less clear now? More clear? All in favor of less clear? Okay, good. All right. So, here we have a bunch of things that people eat and their geographic distribution, not in terms of where they're used today, but where they came from, where they arose in evolutionary history. In North America, we have the turkey. That's like our one contribution in North America to kind of global food supply. Mesoamerica has things like corn and squash and tomatoes. The Andes has llama and potatoes, as well as guinea pigs. Any of you ever have a guinea pig? Guinea pigs. You can eat them in the Andes. If you ever go to Peru, they sell them in restaurants there. You can pop into a restaurant and have a plate of guinea pigs. One of the problems with guinea pigs is it just takes a lot to fill you up. Llamas are not consumed primarily for their meat, but are mainly used for milk. In the Fertile Crescent, we got camels, we got pigs, we got goats, we got sheep, we got ducks. We got, did I mention cows? Goats. China, we've got pigs and water buffalo and chickens. Note, there's no organisms that got domesticated in Africa. Jared Diamond, in his book, he refers to the Anna Karenina principle. You guys know Anna Karenina? Really? They don't have you read Tolstoy anymore in college? No, I have no idea what they expect you to read over in the English department. Although that wouldn't really be English, would it? It would be literature, not English, because it's a Russian novel. First line of the Russian novel, Anna Karenina, says something along the lines of, all happy families are alike, all unhappy families are unhappy for a different reason. And it's this idea that in order for a family to be happy and for a couple to stay together, they have to agree on religion. How you're going to raise your kids. Going to send your kids to public school or private school? Are you going to have an open marriage or an exclusive closed marriage? That's a huge one. How are you going to handle finances? Are you going to buy things on credit or save up for them and then pay for them in full? All these things you have to have two people agreeing on for the relationship to work out over the really long term of having kids, buying a house, buying cars, etc. If you have disagreement on any one of those things, it has the potential for friction in the relationship. So we agree on how we're going to raise your kids, but one person wants to send them to public school and one person wants to send them to private school. The main reason that there's that distinction is public school you don't have to pay for except through your property taxes. Private school you have to pay for, and one person thinks that you should just buy things on credit, and the other person thinks that you should have to save up for things and only spend money on things when you actually have the money for them. And then all of a sudden you're in this big fight about finances that started with choice of schooling for the kids, and before you know it, they're getting a divorce. Another couple may disagree on some other set of issues in the marriage. So Tolstoy's reasoning was, all happy marriages are just alike. Unhappy marriages are unhappy for a bunch of separate reasons. The same thing is true for domesticated animals. And so in Guns, Germs, and Steel, he applies the Anna Karenina principle to domesticated animals. And for domesticated animals, there are some things that it would be nice to have domesticated animals be. One, they need to be big. They need to be big because you don't want to have to raise a bunch of them in order to feed yourself, which is why guinea pigs never took off. They're small. You can eat them. You can raise them in captivity even, but you have to raise a bunch of them in order to get a decent meal out of it. So being big is important. Fast growing is another characteristic that would be good for animals. You don't want to have to wait forever for them to get to a size that they either start producing milk or they're eatable or they start reproducing so that you have a next generation after you consume the first generation. So being big and fast growing, that's hard because not everything that is big grows quickly to that adult size. Some things grow very, very slowly. Some things grow relatively fast. 3, it's better if before you try to domesticate it, it lives in herds. Because if it lives solitarily, chances are it doesn't have immunity to diseases because it doesn't live in an environment where it comes into contact with other members of its same species. If it lives in herds, it's already used to moving around in groups, and so it's easier for you, the human, to get it to move around in groups. 4th, it reaches sexual maturity relatively early in its lifespan, and then after it reaches maturity, it starts pumping out offspring. Because once again, you want to build your herd, and the way you build your herd is through reproduction. And so you don't want to wait 18 months between each offspring, and when they do finally reproduce, they only produce one of them. And the 5th thing, it doesn't want to kill you. So you're growing these big, fast-growing, good reproducing herd animals. It would be a bummer if they wanted to kill you because they're much bigger than you. So when we look at Africa, one of the things that you might ask about Africa is like, man, Africa has big herds of animals. Yet we don't have any domesticated animals that came out of Africa. Somebody give me an example of a stereotypical African savanna organism. A lion, okay. Normally we don't eat predators because predators just generally don't taste good because they've been eating other animals. And so none of our domesticated animals are actually predators. They're all herbivores. Sorry, so I should have been more specific. Give me an herbivore animal from Africa. A gazelle. Okay, so look up a picture of a gazelle. What do gazelles have? They're pretty skinny. They're quick. They are hard to track down. They have big horns also. What do you think they do with those horns? They might try and kill you with those horns. Now, cattle also have horns, but you'll notice that we have varieties of cattle that don't have horns. They're called polled cattle. Give me another animal. Oh, giraffe. Okay, giraffes. Giraffes are certainly big. They do move around in herds. They have really long legs. What do they do with those really long legs? they will stomp you with those long legs. Those long legs are actually a defensive mechanism. It keeps the main body away from most predators. And they have these gigantic feet that they use as weapons. Another animal from southern Africa. Rhinoceros, solitary, not herding. And so they don't typically live in large groups. And as a result, they may be prone to diseases if you put them together in captivity. Another animal. Elephants. In zoos around the world, you know what animal kills more zookeepers than any other animal? Elephants. They live in herds. They get really big, but they want to kill you. Have you guys ever been back in the back area of an elephant house at a zoo? When I was in grad school, I dated a woman who worked at a zoo, and she worked with animals like rhinos and elephants. And so I was at the zoo one day waiting to have lunch with her, and she took me back behind in the back of the elephant house. And I noticed that the elephant house is a big square, and then around this big square are these metal poles. And they're basically big steel poles filled with concrete. And this was back when you trained elephants at zoos so that you could get them to do what you wanted to do. And so as an elephant handler, as an elephant keeper, you had to get the elephants to do what you wanted to do. And they're big. If they don't want to do it, they're not going to do it. So every day you would go through training them. And back in the day, you don't do this anymore in zoos from what I hear, but back in the day you would actually be in the arena with the elephants. And I was like, what's the deal with these big poles? Because there are these gigantic poles and they're spaced about this far apart, and they're a certain distance, uniform distance from the wall. And I asked the head elephant keeper what the deal was with that design. And he's like, they're spaced so that you can run at a full sprint between them, and they're far enough away from the wall that when you flatten your body against the wall, you're further away from the elephant than the longest trunk. Because when you're training an elephant in a zoo, you're basically repeatedly teaching the element that you are the head elephant, that you're the matriarch of that herd of elephants. And elephants challenge the matriarch for control of the herd periodically. And if they challenge you for that role as the leader of the herd, and they win, the first thing they do is they wrap their trunk around you, they pick you up, they turn you on your head, and smash your head into the concrete. So the very design of an elephant house is for you to escape when an elephant is trying to kill you. The bars are far enough so that a person can run at a full sprint through the bars, flatten themselves against the wall, and be far enough away from the elephant that the elephant can't get you. Not only that, elephants take forever to reach sexual maturity. Each time they reproduce, they have an 18-month gestation period. Imagine that, carrying a baby for 18 months. That must be hideous. And then they pop out one elephant. You need all these things to be in place in order for a domestication event to occur in animals. And when you look at the large herding animals of southern Africa, none of them have all of these 5 characteristics. And you really only need one of them to not be there in order to kind of put an end to that domestication plan. We'll talk more about this on Wednesday.